Alright, before we get this episode started, after you watch this, if you enjoy it, please remember to subscribe, like, comment, and share. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch this video and my channel. A big thank you to you for that. Now, here's this week's episode. Now, if you recall our last episode, I just made it back to the lake cabin as a heavy rain and hail started to come down. So, that evening, inside the cabin, protected from the weather, I began the process of reviewing the trail cam videos. Now, here's a little refresher on the location of the 3 trail cams. Now, my original plan was to leave the trail cam data cards in for 3 to 4 weeks before I came back to pull the data. But after that initial recon and setting up the trail cams, I was so excited, so I didn't wait the 3 or 4 weeks. I was back after only 12 days. I pulled the SD cards. I couldn't wait to check them out. Now, after I went through and reviewed them and started to weed out videos of me setting the trail cams, picking the trail cams up, other human activity along the trails or in the woods that set off the camera on this public land. Now, even after weeding all those out, there were still plenty of bucks, does, fawns, turkeys, coyotes, and bears. Over 220 videos. Now, we'll get into the data summary detailed breakdown later, and there were some interesting statistical anomalies for sure. But for now, let's take a look at 20 of the videos that I consider a highlight in the area that happened to be most active in capturing videos, and that was the water hole. Check these out. Now, when I set up the timestamp on this trail cam, I messed up the AM and PM settings. So as you listen to what I say, my time comments and dates are correct. The trail cam is in error because I essentially flip-flopped the PM and AM timeline on the camera. My apologies for this inconvenience, and I do have them correct on all the other trail cams. The first activity was a doe at 9:44 p.m. on 6/27 the first night. It was approximately 5.5 hours after I set up the trail cam. Then at 3:43 a.m. on 6/28, during a light rain, this 6-point cautiously stopped for a drink. Now he hung around, feeding and drinking while nervously watching for any sign of trouble. He was there long enough to have 7 20-second videos taken. Finally taking his last drink and moving off 5 minutes later at 3:48 a.m. About 11 minutes later, at 3:59 a.m., another 6-point was checking out the trail cam up close and personal before moving on. Next, at 5:11 a.m., still on the 28th, another 6-point buck came in, making this the first daylight appearance of a buck at the water hole. He hung around until 5:13 a.m., eventually sent checking the trail cam before moving off. Then Starting at 8:54 p.m. on the 28th, this 6-point came in to check out the water hole. He was quickly joined by a second buck. They appeared to be cautiously tolerating each other while feeding and drinking. By the 8:58 mark, one 6-point is feeding to the left at the tree line, virtually invisible with his head down while he's feeding. Now one of the 6-pointers starts to move towards the camera, aware of something, but not sure. He continues to feed. While the other 6-point returns towards the water hole for a drink, then moves off camera on the right. The 6-point in the foreground continues to feed as he works his way closer to the trail cam. Not sure what to make of this object on the tree, he finally takes a close look before slowly leaving the area at 9:03 p.m. Now, let's resume the action the following morning at 9:30 a.m. as this spiked buck checks out the area, getting a drink and feeding. About 4 to 5 minutes later, he senses something and cautiously stomps his rear legs. Then looks around. He then resumes his feeding. A few minutes later, he returns for a quick drink to wash down his snack. But out of nowhere, at 9:43 a.m., this doe appears, and he chases her off. Just wait a few weeks. His attitude towards those does are going to change. Now, for some reason, there is a break in the action at the water hole for almost 33 hours. When this 6-point buck arrives at 6:36 p.m. on June 29th. And this guy is on high alert. Something is still not right in the area. After moving off, a minute later, the trail cam video is set off, but nothing is picked up on the camera. Whatever it was must have moved along the edge of the frame for a split second, and the camera missed picking it up. So we end up with no evidence as to why the 6-pointer was on high alert. About an hour and a half later at 8:12 p.m., this 4-point buck shows up, cautiously checking, on alert as it feeds and drinks, before finally leaving at 8:17 p.m. Now at 11:07 p.m., the trail cam is set off as this doe is moving through during a driving heavy downpour. And about 45 minutes later, the rain has slowed down and more does are showing up in the area. With the rainfall replenishing the water hole, deer activity starts to return to normal, as this 4-pointer showing up at 5:45 a.m. on June 30th was feeding and drinking for nearly 5 minutes. Next, on July 1st at 6:30 a.m., this doe and fawn are at the water hole. Now the fawn is having a great time jumping around in the water hole while mom is feeding. But that changes quickly as mom becomes alert to danger, and both the doe and the fawn take off. Now watch the right side at the tree line and you'll see why. This coyote had designs on an easy meal for sure. At 10:08 p.m. on the 4th, this doe is calmly drinking, but tensions arise as a second doe moves in for a drink at the water hole. Moving ahead again for another highlight on July 5th at 8:37 p.m. when this big-bodied but smaller racked 6-point buck shows up. As another 6-pointer shows up, he moves off. Now about 2 minutes later, that 6-pointer runs off in the opposite direction, but then returns to the water hole. It looks like he's trying to leave a scrape. Now, on the morning of July 6th at 5:28 a.m., this soon-to-be stud of an 8-pointer makes a daylight appearance. A minute later, as the 8-point is in the background tree line, this 4-point makes his way in for a drink. Now the 8-point remains in the wood line content on feeding. But as the 4-point moves north along the tree line, the 8-pointer comes over to check him out. What I first thought would be a great video of the 8-point exerting its dominance turned into a non-event. As the 8-point walked past, the 4-point gave way and moved further into the tree line feeding. And just like that, it was over. In an unusual turn of events, the 8-point had moved on. Again, some interesting behavior from the single doe at 7:22 a.m. on the morning of July 7th. This jumping and splashing continued for a while. It was like she was looking to draw attention to herself. And she finally did, as this big body 6-point buck moved in to take a look. Now she approached, but was rebuffed by this 6-pointer. Undeterred, she tried again, but the buck turned her away again, this time for good. Talk about turning the tables. The bucks come fall chase does all the time, but now here in July, this buck didn't want anything to do with her. He just wanted to eat. Now, the last trail cam highlight encounter from the waterhole area occurred at 6:38 a.m. on the morning of July 8th. It began with the 6-point buck that I nicknamed Lumpy, due to the large lump on his shoulder, who was joined by a 4-point buck and another 6-point buck and a doe. Now, Lumpy wasted no time shooing the 4-pointer away from the waterhole. then immediately went after the smaller rack 6-point. But they didn't leave the area. Now Lumpy even shook his head aggressively at the doe as she approached for a drink. The small rack 6-point tried to approach for a drink as Lumpy's back was turned, but Lumpy wouldn't tolerate it, and he aggressively moved the small rack 6-point away from the waterhole. Lumpy continued to aggressively defend his territory of the waterhole by chasing off all the deer anytime they tried to approach. Then he showed his dominance by rearing up on 2 legs and jumping around the waterhole. Again, these were only some of what I thought were the most interesting highlights of the 88 deer videos taken on the trail cam at the waterhole. Now, let's keep this trail cam video review going. Let's take a look at the area that had the second most videos on a trail cam, which was at the ridge line just west of the waterhole. The first activity at the ridgeline trail cam started at 6:35 p.m. on the 27th of June, only 2.5 hours after I had set the trail cam, as this doe was scent checking as she worked her way across the ridgeline. In fact, there were 27 20-second videos taken during the first 24 hours from the ridgeline trail cam, and they were all does. Now all that doe activity started to change a day later as this first buck, a 4-pointer, walked past the trail cam at 7:30 p.m. and then the action started. About 1 minute later, this 6-point buck came in and the 4-pointer took off. This 6-point hung around feeding for quite a while. Then a couple of hen turkeys were working their way through, feeding on whatever was available on the ground. All the while, the white-tailed deer was occasionally checking on them, but neither the buck or the turkeys were seemingly concerned about each other. Then slowly, starting in the left-hand foreground, another 4-point buck cautiously started to feed and was slowly moving in the direction of the 6-pointer. But he changed his mind and stayed out of the 6-pointer's immediate area. Finally, both moved away. Wow, now that was a lot of action on the ridgeline in about an 11-minute span of time. Now about 3 minutes later at 7:44 p.m., that same 6-pointer that had just moved out was back feeding on the ridgeline again. But by 7:48 p.m., he left, and that 4-pointer that was there snuck in for a snack before moving off towards the south. Now the buck action continued with another 6-point buck cruising the ridgeline at 8:48 p.m. He was watching on alert to the south and southwest. When a doe appeared in frame coming from the west, the doe cautiously stayed in the six-pointer's orbit, but would not close in. Finally, when the six-point headed east down the ridge, the doe moved in to see what food source the six-pointer was snacking on. She stayed there while the six-point was searching the flat bottom of the ridgeline for more food. The next morning at 5:29 a.m. on the 29th, this familiar big-bodied six-point showed up. Now he's becoming a regular in front of the trail cams, and I hope this movement pattern continues into the fall. I'm guessing this well-nourished deer will grow his rack into an awesome specimen. But this six-point is quickly fine-tuning his alert senses for late fall activity. Now, we'll skip ahead a little bit to later in the day on the 29th at 7:11 p.m. Now, we have an inquisitive spike buck slowly approaching the camera and then moving off to the west. But his curiosity got the best of him, and he returned to get a good look at this non-natural tree growth that makes a low-intensity sound. Now, curious but not alarmed, this buck becomes content to snack a little bit more before moving off. Now, as we move ahead a few days, our big body six-point makes a return appearance on July 2nd at 4:33 a.m., this time with a doe in tow in the background. He glances around to check on the doe, but not seeing she moved, he returns to feed. A little while later, a four-point tries to move into the area, but the big-bodied six runs him out. Now, our trail cam seemingly piques his interest, and as he's focused on our trail cam, that four-point circles back around behind him to sneak in a snack. Then he moves off in the same direction that the six-point left. Then, from early morning on the 2nd of July at 5:45 a.m. until I picked up the SD cards on July 8th, the white-tailed deer activity on the ridgeline finished out just as it had started, strictly doe. From July 2nd through July 8th, there were 40 20-second videos taken, again, all of them does. Now, once again, these videos were only some of what I thought were the highlights from the trail cam located at the ridgeline location. Next, let's take a look at some video trail cam review highlights from our last camera, which was located at the crossroads area. About 4 hours after setting the trail cam up on June 27th, this nice 6-point buck appears on the trail. He makes a few snack stops before heading south down the trail. And the buck parade continues when at 6:51 p.m. these two 4-pointers hang around feeding and checking out the trail cam. The next day on the 28th at 5:59 p.m., this 6-point buck makes a brief appearance on the trail. Then, later that same day, it's 11:40 p.m. as this 8-point specimen shows his survival skills passing through the crossroads heading east down the trail. Then some 20 hours later at 9:29 p.m., the next day, a real surprise on the trail cam. This large black bear is headed north as he passes the crossroads trail cam. Now let's move to early evening on the 30th of July, as we have a spiked buck and 2 does appearing at the crossroads. The spike shows no interest in the 2 does, as all 3 of them are grazing their way through the crossroads area. But again, I'll guarantee you, in a couple of months, that spike's attitude towards the does is going to change, believe me. Now, we'll jump ahead again to July 2nd at 1:28 a.m. as this black bear passes through the crossroads area. Now, it's hard to tell if this is a different bear from the previous one captured at 9:30 p.m. on June 29th. Then, on July 4th at 8:42 p.m., this 8-point buck makes a surprising daylight Independence Day pre-firework appearance. Now, about 6 minutes later, this doe stands ready as her 2 fawns catch up to nurse and receive some nourishment. Then Mom moves east along the trail with both fawns in tow. And then finally, in the early morning hours of July 7th, these 2 statuesque does are in alert mode, before signaling that everything is okay and resume normal activity. Now, being on public land, I knew I'd have company out there. Plus, the roadways have been approved for ATV use, so the ATV ranges have expanded. Being able to use the roadways with an ATV will open up the off-road trails by expanding the ATV's range without having to trailer it from spot to spot. Okay, so let's take one more look at some trail cam video activity that shows man-made movement other than me on this public land. Check this out. Now, there was a 5.5-day span until July 1st when a trail cam picked up human activity, as this ATV passed by the crossroads trail cam, at first heading east, then backing up to go north, and finally returning past the trail cam heading south at 6:27 p.m. Next, on July 2nd at 12:33 p.m., this pedal-style electric trail bike headed down the trail to the east. Then, on July 3rd at 12:17 p.m., this pickup is out on the trail for a little recon drive. Later, still on July 3rd at 5:26 p.m., another ATV heads north on the Crossroads Trail, returning back to the crossroads about 14 minutes later and driving off down the East Trail. Now that same ATV returns 2 days later on July 5th at 2:46 p.m., and it looks like it's got a load of gear in the rear bed, and it heads down the trail east again. Then, on the afternoon of July 7th, another pickup truck is doing a recon drive heading east along the Crossroads Trail. And the final human activity video occurs on July 7th at dusk near dark at 9:20 p.m. as this smaller SUV heads east down the trail. Well, now this is a new situation for me, public land, with the word public meaning other people. Now, there's going to be a lot more activity than I've been accustomed to on the private land that I've hunted the last 20 years. So, my learning curve is expanding again. Now I ponder the effect of the increase in human activity on the animal movement on public land. Looks like I got a whole new data set to work out. Now, with that being said, let's take a look at the SD data card statistical review from 6/27/23 through 7/8/23. Let's take a look at some of the statistical breakdowns from my rough notes. First, let's look at total deer appearing on the trail cams. That total was 216 videos. There were 136 videos of does, or 63% of all videos, and there were 62 videos of bucks, or 29% of all videos. And there was 18 videos of fawn, or 8% of all videos. Now the doe to buck ratio is 2.19 to 1, or 2.19 does for every one buck. Now, for all deer, 47% of all deer showed daytime activity, while 53% of the deer showed nighttime activity. Now, for does, they were only active 40% of the time during the daytime hours, and 60% of the time during the nighttime hours. Now, for bucks, this was a little unusual, but they were active 58% of the time during daytime, and only 42% of the time during the nighttime hours. Now, this statistical anomaly shows a greater percentage of bucks that showed themselves during daylight hours, by 18% more than the does. That's kind of unusual. Number 3, we're looking at the best 1 hour time period for all deer activity. But the statistical data makes it difficult to pick just 1 hour. Now, for all deer, there were 3 time periods with only a 0.9% difference. Now, the 6 a.m. to 6:59 a.m. was at 12.5% activity. The 5 a.m. to 5:59 a.m. was at 12% activity. And the evening 8 p.m. to 8:59 p.m. was at 11.6% activity levels. But when you combine the 2 morning hours between 5 a.m. and 6:59 a.m., that showed 24.5% of all deer activity. Now for doe, the best 1 hour time period was 8 p.m. to 8:59 p.m. with 14% of all doe activity. But a 3 hour combined time slot of 5 a.m. through 7:59 a.m. had 26.5% of all doe activity. And it didn't get any easier for the bucks. Now, there were 2 time periods with only a 1.6% difference. And if you look at the numbers, there was only a 1 deer difference between those 2 time periods. The 6 a.m. to 6:59 a.m. period had 17.7% of the buck activity, and the 5 a.m. to 5:59 a.m. time slot had 16.1% of the activity. Again, only a 1 deer difference between the 2 periods. But if you combine those 2 hours, from 5 a.m. to 6:59 a.m., you had 33.9% of all buck activity. And number 4, the buck breakdown. Of the 62 bucks on the trail cam, 14 were spikes, or 23% of all the bucks. 11 were 4-pointers, or 18% of the bucks. 33 of them were 6-pointers, or 53% of all the bucks. And 4 were 8-pointers, or 6% of the bucks. Harvest target bucks, the 6 and 8-pointers, at roughly 60% of all the bucks that showed up on the videos. And the younger bucks, the spikes and the 4-pointers, which were in at about 40% of all the bucks. And number 5, since we are interested in harvesting bucks, let's take a look at the time slot movement of bucks based on rack size. Now, there were 4 8-pointers, and their activity was 2 showed during the 5 a.m. to 5:59 a.m. time slot, 1 showed up during the 8 a.m. to 8:59 a.m. time slot, and 1 showed up in the evening hours of the 11 p.m. to 11:59 p.m. time slot. So 75% of 8-point activity was daylight time. Now, if this was bow season, being out there between 5 a.m. and 9 a.m. is when you're putting the percentages in your favor to encounter one of the 8-point bucks. Well, now you get the idea. Data mining your trail cam pictures for additional statistical info can really turn the tables in your favor. I've only shown you a couple of ideas here. You can now take this data that you've been looking at and say, let's look at specific locations. So you can really data mine this information. And my philosophy on hunting whitetails is put the percentages in your favor. Now, statistical info retrieved from data mining your trail cam pics and videos can put you in the right place at the right time. You give it a try and increase your percentage chances. Hey, thanks for watching. We'll catch you on the next episode. Feel free to comment below, or if you don't want to comment in the public eye, we can also be reached at rapantoutdoors360@gmail.com. Now, if you know somebody you think might enjoy this video series, please feel free to go ahead and share this video or this link with your friend. And as always, whether you fish or hunt, remember, practice CCR. Catch, conserve, replenish. Make sure that that resource is available for future generations. See you next time, guys.